going to answer this question in this video. I don't think, but I do think this is a useful and interesting exercise. I want to walk through it and learn from it. I am more pro-weed than I am pro-gambling. And these are broadly two categories of things that, for certain people, fun and fine, for certain people, destructive. And society has at various times stepped in and controlled those things for those reasons. So big picture, I want to make the case that there is something similar about the criminalization of gambling and the criminalization of marijuana, and also like the legalization and societal acceptance of both weed and gambling. Both of those things are happening right now. So they were previously more tightly controlled, and now they are less tightly controlled, both of them. I am much more worried about gambling than I am about weed. But we can also say that gambling is for many people just a fun thing that they like to do. And so there are people who will say, why would you make the government take away this thing that I find entertaining? In the same way that people who smoke weed will feel that way. And then third, let's just make a list. 1, gambling and weed are fun for most, destructive for some. 2, gambling and weed both used to be more tightly regulated. 3, both are now I think we should say broadly decriminalized. Like sports betting, there are some places where you can't do it, but like mostly you could download an app and start betting right now if you live in America. And also you can there's so much sports gambling advertising. And downtown in my town, there's tons of weed shops. Now, of course, that's not the case everywhere. We are, again, the United States of America, and the states have different laws. But I'll say more broadly decriminalized. I am more worried about gambling. Why? That's the case. That's the thing I'm trying to figure out. This, as I had the thought, seemed like an interesting thing to examine about myself. And so I'd like to walk you through the process that I use when I identify something that I think is interesting. I'm not saying that it doesn't make sense to me, but I am aware that I'm going to have a bunch of biases that make me think that the thing I believe is the right thing to believe. Right? So let's walk through some of the ways I examined. First, I thought about it. I thought to myself, well, what are the reasons? The first thing I came up with is because gambling is worse. So you could say, we could have this pure libertarian society where whatever decision someone wants to make, whether that's doing heroin or gambling or whatever, that should be okay as long as it's not hurting somebody else. If it's societally destructive, that's but if it's not directly hurting another person, then that thing should be allowed. And lots of people argue for that. And that's kind of one of the arguments for the legalization of gambling and drugs. But I don't think that that's the right thing to do. I don't think heroin should be legal. I think there are some drugs that we should criminalize, we should stigmatize, we should put people in jail for bringing it into the country, all that stuff. But I think that the reason why I feel that way about heroin but not weed is because heroin's worse than weed. Meth is worse than weed. In some cases, alcohol might be worse than weed. It kills a lot of people. Alcohol-related deaths U.S. per year. This is an astounding stat to me. 178,000 deaths. Ooh. Second thing, I think that the criminalization of weed has been a thing for my entire life and for many years before that. And I think that the impacts of that criminalization are bad. So there's a historical component here. And I also think that also leads into there's an element of gambling that is about capitalist stuff that's preying on your hopes and dreams and selling you a hope and a dream and delivering for you, in many cases, destitution. And that's a moral argument almost. There's a moral wrongness. And also you have to make the case that there is a good element. What's the good that comes from both of these things? I feel like weed delivers more good in the way that Coca-Cola does, I don't drink a Coke and I'm I like this right now. And my life isn't any better tomorrow because I had a Coke. But I'm not going to say don't sell Coke in America just because it messes with people's blood sugar, because I don't think that it delivers long-term benefit. Sometimes it's about hedonism. And I think that that's the same with gambling. There is a hedonic joy to the process of that risk. And I engage in kinds of gambling that just aren't monetary, right? I go out on the internet and I say shit. That actually might come from a similar place as a gambler, that I just am sensation seeking and I want to risk something. I want to do a risk right now. And so that's just, it's a kind of value even if it's not like a pro-social value. But there is both like a worse component, like the outcomes are worse, and like the delivery of the actual feeling is better. But I'm not a gambler. I hate gambling. And so of course I feel that way, that like the fun part of gambling has to be worse than the fun part of weed. I just want to be clear. I don't smoke weed. I will occasionally do an edible, sometimes for fun and sometimes for sleep. And I like recognize I'm actually like, I can feel being duller the next day. So I do not encourage chronic use of weed. And I think that's one of the big problems with both weed and gambling, is that almost everyone who does it is a light user of both of those things, and it does not impact their lives in a significant way. But the people who do it the most, who are chronic users who have problems with those things, whether that's, you could call it an addictive disorder or not, those people are really harmed in a way that I think making both of those things more available does make things worse for them. And I want to be clear here that like I do feel like it is proper in some circumstances for some of my rights to be taken away to help people who have a different response than I do to things. For example, I think that it's okay to make gambling harder to do, even though it doesn't hurt me, and even though I might enjoy it, even though someone else might enjoy it. I think that it is okay to limit my access to it to protect someone who is not me. So these are the 4 that I sort of came up with on my own, but then I went on Blue Sky and I said, I'm trying to figure something out. Why am I broadly pro-weed and anti-gambling? And so we're going to see if people's perspectives lined up with mine, or if they had any. This is a tool that I have access to that most people don't have access to. I got a lot of responses to this, over 200. And so we're going to go through some of them and see like what I'm missing. This person, Gestalt Ersat Squatch, wow, says weed doesn't hurt people the way gambling does. So that lines up exactly with the first thought I had, and 193 people liked that. Wax Monkey says weed delivers what it promises, being stoned. Gambling lies and tells you that. So we've got that moral argument. So like, let's mark these as sort of like utilitarian, historical, capitalism, lies, etc. And then we got, this is sort of like an opposite side of the utilitarian. So that could be combined into one. Likely because so many people are extremely misled on cannabis in general, and because in gambling, the house always wins. So that's sort of that moral argument, but there is an element of the historical argument of like people not knowing what is going on. We've got utilitarian. One is utilitarian, dangerous addiction. The other, raid the fridge with the lads. I think that we might underestimate the amount of people with problematic relationships with marijuana, and that has, I feel, has gone up since legalization in my place. Weed is actually a net neutral for society and most individuals, while gambling destroys lives. I vibe with that. Like, I feel like that's right. Weed can be helpful in some cases. Gambling doesn't even have the capacity to be helpful. It's inherently dangerous. Are there positives to gambling? I have no idea. What positives to gambling would be? An increase in tax revenues and tourism, as well as positive impact on the local economy. Yeah, so garbage reason. Let me do something else. Let's real quick. Let's make a Google form. Just a quick survey here. Do you smoke weed? Yes, no, maybe. Yes, no. Just yes, no. Let's just do yes, no. Let's make it simple for myself. Do you gamble? What's more fun and what's more destructive? And we're going to take this form, gambling and weed, and we are going to ask the question. We're going to do it on Twitter because those people won't have seen that I'm doing this on Blue Sky. Can you fill out a quick survey for me on cannabis and gambling? Post. And we're going to go back to that after we read some more of these. Well, hey, all right. I know that I'm wearing a Christmas sweater and Christmas is over, but here's the situation. We're doing a new thing at Good.Store. You might have heard about this. We are doing underwear. They're very nice. I'm wearing them right now, but I'm going to show you my underwear. I think that we did a very good job with it. It's made from modal. It's got a nice waistband. Modal is like a kind of fabric. Let me see. Let me read what modal is. Modal is a semi-synthetic fabric made from beech tree pulp. It's like more soft and more environmental is the idea. It's used for clothing and household items. It's a type of rayon, more durable and flexible. It's considered a luxurious textile because it is soft and expensive. All right. And while the Good Store underwear are soft, they're not that expensive, honestly. In fact, I think that they're cheaper now than they will be in the future. But if you are interested in buying them or have, This is the sort of information gathering portion of the product development cycle for us. So we've sold some of them. If you bought them, if you could go leave a review, an honest review of what you think of the product, that would be fantastic. If you would like to buy some, there are still some in the warehouse. Thank you to everybody who's left reviews. They're not easy to find on the website because they are kind of an experimental product. But if you go to a good store and you just search for underwear, you'll find them. And there's also a link in the description. Thank you, everybody, for checking it out. Real studies showing it can harm people, and one is mostly a harmless vice. I mean, I don't know. There are real studies showing that THC can harm people. Cannabis can be a net positive. Like, cannabis can be a net positive, and it feels like gambling is never a net negative except for the people who work in the gambling industry, which increasingly isn't that many people. If you turn it into something that just happens on your phone and it's infinitely scalable and there are no like blackjack dealers, that's bad. That decreases that one advantage that you had. I feel like the frickin' phonification of it was a huge mistake. One of them is actively predatory. I mean, I think that we have to be honest about the fact that putting capitalism onto weed isn't great. Putting capitalism onto beer isn't great. And then I commented on this one earlier. This is the first person I saw talk about the historical element. There's a lot of overlap between the people most harmed by the criminalization of weed and the legalization of gambling. And that's really interesting. So their harm is done by criminalization. So increased interactions with law enforcement. Law enforcement might use a thing that is both common and criminalized to go after a population that they want to go after. I never worried in high school about getting in that much trouble for smoking weed, whereas someone who was black would have to worry about that much more. In general, that's a race thing. It's also a class thing. And in the same way, the systems that use gambling and lotteries and they are about extracting money, usually not from the wealthy, usually, not always. The wealthy are not as likely to suffer from a gambling addiction, is the feeling I have. Mandy says, are you anti-gambling at all levels and scale? No. From a bet between friends and penny ante poker to huge conglomerates plastering ads on sporting events. If not, what's the scale at which it becomes so comfortable? Mandy, this is the hard part. And most countries are less like this than America, where we ask, well, if we're going to do it at all, we have to do it all or nothing. We can start wherever we want to start. And if there's an obvious thing, let's just do the obvious thing instead of asking exactly where the line is. So let's just say we need to stop them, from advertising. No more advertising. That seems bad. And then if we want to take another step, you could say no more phone gambling. Let's not let someone download an app and ruin their lives. Let's make them go to a place where there's going to be some kind of economic benefit to the town, at least, instead of all the money going to FanDuel, wherever they are. I see so many gambling ads on stuff that is watched by teenagers on YouTube, by creators who I know and like. And I'm like, how are you feeling okay about this? This is funny. One does no harm when legalized. The other destroys minds, bodies, and lives. I just don't think that's true. I think that they both do harm to some people. In my head, gambling is clearly a form of exploitation, whereas weed is an actual product. I do rather like this argument that is just a moral one. It's like, this feels wrong. I think that is where a lot of my opinion on this actually comes from. Of course, the moral argument is going to be subjective, but I am interested, now that we've given it some time, to check out how my poll went. I'm not surprised to see that far fewer of my audience gambles than smokes weed. And I'm a little bit surprised by how many people think that gambling is fun, especially considering that how many of them smoke weed. But I'm also not surprised that is very interesting how many people feel like gambling is more destructive. But there are some people who think that cannabis is more destructive. It's there on the list. And we can sort that, and we can actually get just the people who said they don't use cannabis and they do gamble. So it's not that many people. That's not surprising. How do they feel? What's more destructive, cannabis or gambling? I mean, they all say gambling. So I think that this is interesting. These are the people who gamble and don't smoke weed. And they think what's more fun? Gambling. Obviously, they all think gambling is more fun. But they all identify gambling as more destructive. So I know that I'm not doing real science here, but I'm doing a survey of a particular group of people, and the ones who don't smoke and do gamble think that gambling is more destructive. I'm actually surprised. And then the ones that do both are mixed on whether cannabis or gambling is more fun, but they mostly all think gambling is more destructive. And then there's going to be the people who do neither, and they mostly think that gambling is more destructive. Now, this is a vibe that a lot of people have, and that's valuable, but you could do the research, and like actually trying to figure out how to do the research would be hard. So I'm not comfortable in my little doc here saying, am I right about the utilitarian thing? I'm comfortable saying probably. The people who gamble and don't smoke weed say that gambling is more destructive. So that feels like a probably to me. But I'm sure that people who've done a bunch of research on this, and there are experts you could talk to who would answer this question. Because I think we might be being like informed by the historical context there of the amount of time we've spent with cannabis prohibitions and the impacts that they have had. Speaking of, am I right about historical stuff? I mean, yeah, I am. I think that a lot of harm was done by cannabis criminalization. I think that harm is done by its legalization. I just think that the harm done by criminalization was worse. And I think that it was unfair, and I think it was unjust. I'm comfortable with like a probably here, because ultimately we're not through with the experiment, and I think we should regulate it more tightly, frankly. And I think that that's really hard, because once you have an illegal market, it is hard to create a regulated market, because the illegal market will always be there to be like take over if the regulation becomes too onerous. But I think that the harms done there, especially if you compare it with alcohol or cigarettes, all those things are bad for you. And I think that the people who have a bad relationship with THC would be helped by it being harder to get it. I just don't think, I think that calculus is a little bit off, especially since we've seen it. You know, we saw it in the real world. And you can also make the argument that making weed illegal weakens the police, weakens our systems, because people use it and they're like, this isn't that bad. I'd rather have it be illegal than people being like, I've been told my whole life that I can't do this, and like, it's nothing. It's like a different high than cigarettes, but it's like, they're both a high, and it's way less addictive. Again, I am legitimately not pro smoking weed. I don't think you should do it, but I'm also very not in favor of alcohol. Like, I think that we do these things not for our health, you know? Like, alcohol is, after cigarettes, probably the number one preventable cause of cancer. And that's only one of the terrible things that alcohol does to our society. But I am actually, and of course I am, I'm most comfortable with this moral argument that Alec made and that a couple other people made. Weed delivers what it says on the tin. You know, you've smoked weed and you're going to go get more weed to get that again. But what gambling does, it's almost like a trick that our brains play on us, that people exploit for profit. And I don't think it's the same as weed. Weed is playing a trick on your brain. It's interfering with your neurotransmitters and making you feel a way. But to promise hope and always eventually deliver destitution is what gambling does. And so I'm actually pretty comfortable saying I am right about the moral element here. And of course I feel that way because the morality is going to be subjective. And I think there'll probably be some people who say like, no, like the sort of capitalist motivations of all these weed shops, they want you to put stuff in your body and they want to get you more hooked on it. They want to sort of make it look more fun. And it's got like the weed shop, one of the weed shops in my town is called Cookies. And I'm like, I don't know you should do that. You should be like weed. It should say weed. Like Cookies makes me sound like a kid should go in there and shop. I do like it though. They have great customer support. But I think we should be aware that both gambling problems and marijuana problems are hard to see. We don't always see them in the people that are even closest to us. It's hard to know exactly where we're at with these things. I think we should be honest about it. I've always been in favor of marijuana decriminalization. I'm very glad that it has begun to happen in real ways. So my question isn't like, should we make weed illegal again? It's, should I be as worried about gambling as I am? And I think ultimately, like, I am. And people are going to draw this line in different places. And they're going to say, but I like gambling. I wouldn't want it to be made illegal just because somebody has a problem when I don't. And I get that. But are you okay with saying no more advertising? Because, like, do you really like FanDuel ads? Probably not. Let's start there. Let's start with simple stuff. Let's start with making it a little bit more friction, a little bit harder to develop a kind of gambling problem that's going to become a serious financial problem and also maybe threaten your life, because suicide is a common outcome. Criminal activity, attempted suicide, and suicide are all side effects of gambling addiction. I think some people might look at this video and say, Hank, you didn't have to do all this. The vibes were correct. But my vibes are often off. And I also want to make it clear that I'm not entirely sure that the utilitarian argument here is correct. Like, it may be that sort of the, Coca-Cola hedonistic desire for that risk that comes along with gambling is a valuable enough service for the people who do it, and also for the economies that it supports, that's worth the harm done to the people who are more set up mentally or in their sort of situation, whatever it is, or just like get unlucky, who end up developing a problem with gambling. And where that line falls on the, like, we got to allow it for most people, even though it harms some people, or we have to regulate it for all people because it harms most people, where that line falls is a bit of a mystery. But like, it is always going to be to some extent based on vibes. And I think that because there's this moral element for me, where it's like, this is just shitty. Like, to take hope and weaponize it for exploitation of people and to make their lives a little bit more hopeless, or a lot more hopeless, is awful. Like, that industry grosses me out. So I feel like because I have this moral reaction to it, my vibes around both the historical and utilitarian vibes are going to be less trustable. And a thing that I've been thinking so much about as we sort of head into this new world that we all have to exist in is I really want to have some kind of pretty strong allegiance to the truth. And so I want to challenge myself to examine if it seems like something's a little weird. Like, why do I want to control people's ability to gamble, but not their ability to smoke weed, when both of those things do sometimes have bad outcomes on people? I want to challenge that. I want to take the time to think about it. And I also wanted to model it in real time for folks. And so that's what I did. And now the video's over.